Think trains are boring? Think again. Some of America's most terrifying machines rolled on rails, conquering mountains that shouldn't have been touched and descending grades that defied physics. From avalanche zones to passes nicknamed the Gila Monster, we're counting down 10 American-made locomotives that earned their reputation the hard way. Let's roll. 10. Baldwin Locomotive Works, Model 1026, E-Consolidation, number 111. Built in 1926 by Philadelphia's Baldwin Locomotive Works, this narrow-gauge 2-8-0 Consolidation spent 40 years hauling bananas through El Salvador before finding its way to Colorado's Georgetown Loop Railroad. The number 111 operates on one of America's most notorious stretches of track, crossing the Devil's Gate High Bridge, a 95-foot-tall trestle that spans Clear Creek Gorge. When this beast creeps across that bridge at dead slow speed, you can feel the whole structure tremble beneath its 38-inch drivers. This Baldwin Consolidation packs serious muscle, featuring 16 by 20-inch cylinders that generate enough force to pull trains up grades that would make modern engineers quit on the spot. What makes the Georgetown Loop truly frightening is covering just 2 miles between Georgetown and Silver Plume while gaining 640 feet through 4.5 miles of track. The route includes horseshoe curves and multiple creek crossings with grades hitting 4%. The number 111 runs on 3-foot narrow gauge track, meaning there's precious little room for error on those curves. One miscalculation and you're learning to fly, courtesy of gravity. Baldwin built this machine to handle tropical terrain, but watching it navigate Colorado's mountains feels like tempting fate. Today, it still operates tourist excursions, giving riders a first-hand taste of what it meant to trust your life to steel, steam, and the steady hands of an engineer who knew these mountains didn't forgive mistakes. 9. American Locomotive Company, Alco, 4-8-8-4, Big Boy number 4014. Built by the American Locomotive Company between 1941 and 1944, the Union Pacific Big Boys were the largest successful steam locomotives ever constructed. At 133 feet long and weighing 1.2 million pounds, these monsters were heavier than a Boeing 747. The 4-8-8-4 configuration meant 16 68-inch driving wheels pounding rails with 135,375 pounds of starting tractive effort. These beasts were designed to haul 3,600-ton freight trains over the Wasatch Mountains unassisted, tackling grades that would break lesser machines. The boiler operated at 300 pounds per square inch, feeding cylinders 23 3/4 inches in diameter with a 32-inch stroke. What made them terrifying wasn't just their size, but their assignment. The Big Boys operated between Ogden, Utah, and Cheyenne, Wyoming, over Sherman Hill, where altitude reaches 8,640 feet. At those elevations, oxygen is thin, weather can turn lethal without warning, and a runaway train becomes an unstoppable force of destruction. The frames were articulated, essentially hinged, to allow them to negotiate curves that would derail a rigid locomotive of that length. Engineer Otto Jabelman's team designed them to travel smoothly at 80 miles per hour, but normal operations kept them below 60 miles per hour in freight service. Peak horsepower hit 6,290 at about 41 miles per hour. Today, Big Boy number 4014 operates as Union Pacific's heritage locomotive, restored in 2019. Watching this mechanical titan climb Sherman Hill, you're witnessing engineering that pushed the absolute limits of what steel and steam could achieve. Alco built 25 of these giants exclusively for Union Pacific. They weren't experiments. They were answers to an impossible question. How do you move maximum tonnage over mountains that want to kill you? 8. Norfolk and Western TE1 class, Jawn Henry, number 2300. In 1954, Baldwin Lima Hamilton and Babcock and Wilcox created a monster that looked like it rolled straight out of a diesel nightmare. The Norfolk and Western number 2300, nicknamed Jawn Henry after the steel-driving legend who died racing a steam drill, was the longest steam locomotive ever built at 161 feet. This experimental steam turbine electric weighed 818,000 pounds in a C+C-C+C configuration. so massive it couldn't fit on any of N&W's turntables, the Babcock and Wilcox water tube boiler operated at 600 pounds per square inch, double the pressure of conventional steam locomotives. The steam turbine produced 4,500 horsepower at 8,000 RPM, creating a banshee-like whoosh instead of the traditional chuff-chuff. Engineers reported it sounded like a jet engine from hell. The turbine generated 175,000 pounds starting tractive effort and 144,000 pounds at 9 miles per hour. But here's what made it truly terrifying. The automatic boiler controls were dangerously unreliable. The system would randomly spike pressure or drop it without warning. Coal dust and water constantly infiltrated the General Electric traction motors, causing electrical shorts and fires. Crews reported that operating the Jawn Henry felt like trying to control a nuclear reactor on wheels. The toxic combination of extreme steam pressure, electrical systems, and coal combustion created multiple catastrophic failure points. After just 3 years of troubled service, during which it spent more time in shops than on rails, N&W scrapped it in 1957. Number 2,300 was stricken from the roster January 4th, 1958, and cut up in 1961. The Jawn Henry proved that combining steam turbine technology with railroad operations was like trying to harness a tornado, theoretically possible, but practically suicidal. 7. Virginian Railway Class AE2-10-10-2, number 800 to 809. In 1918, Alco's Schenectady Works built 10 of these articulated mallet compounds that were so massive they had to be shipped in pieces. The cabs and low-pressure cylinders were removed for transport and reassembled on site. The Virginian's Class A, E, 2-10-10-2s featured 48-inch low-pressure cylinders, the largest ever used on any U.S. locomotive. These cylinders were so enormous they had to be inclined upward several degrees just to clear the rails. The boiler was the widest of any locomotive at 118.5 inches diameter at the rear tube sheet. These monsters generated 147,200 pounds tractive effort in compound mode, or a terrifying 176,600 pounds in simple mode. They weighed over 684,500 pounds and stretched nearly 100 feet with their wheelbase. What made them scary was their territory, the 2.07% grades over Clark's Gap Mountain 1. AE hauled 110 loaded coal cars totaling 17,250 tons from Princeton to Roanoke. The locomotives operated on the steepest, most punishing sections of the Virginian, where grades and curves would destroy ordinary engines. The outside frame design meant everything mechanical was exposed. You could watch massive rods and counterweights thrashing like industrial hammers. The tenders were abnormally small due to turntable limitations, requiring more frequent stops in hostile mountain territory. These machines operated for 34 years until 1952, primarily as pushers on grades that would stall conventional locomotives. They handled loads that seemed physically impossible, proving that Alco understood what it meant to build locomotives for railroads that operated beyond normal limits. None survived scrapping, but their legacy remains. When you need to move 17,000 tons of coal over mountains, you build something that looks and operates like it came from an industrial nightmare. 6. Baldwin Locomotive Works K36, Class 2-8-2, Mikado. Baldwin's Eddystone, Pennsylvania facility delivered 10 of these narrow-gauge monsters to the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad in 1925. The K36 designation indicates approximately 36,200 pounds of tractive effort, making these the most powerful narrow-gauge steam locomotives Baldwin ever built. Each K36 weighs 187,100 pounds, with 143,850 pounds riding on 44-inch drivers. The 20 by 24-inch cylinders, combined with a boiler pressure of 195 pounds per square inch, generate enough power to move serious tonnage up serious grades. The firebox measures 145 square feet with a grate area of 40.2 square feet, among the largest ever built for narrow-gauge locomotives. The K36s operated on the Durango and Silverton narrow-gauge railroad, hauling trains through the Animas Canyon where the track clings to cliffsides hundreds of feet above the river. One section, nicknamed the High Line, runs along a ledge blasted from solid granite with a sheer drop on one side and rock wall on the other. There's no guardrail, there's no margin for error. When a K36 is pulling a train through the High Line at 15 miles per hour, passengers on the outside can look straight down and see the Animas River far below. The route from Durango to Silverton covers 45 miles with grades hitting 2.5% on curves so tight that longer equipment can't navigate them. 4 K36s remain operational on the Durango and Silverton today, while 5 more operate on the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. When you're riding behind a K36, you're experiencing what railroading meant before safety regulations and modern engineering. It meant trusting Baldwin's metalwork and the engineer's skill against gravity, momentum, and mountains that don't care about your schedule. 5. American Locomotive Company, Alco. K28, Class 2-8-2, Mikado. Built by Alco's Schenectady, New York Works in 1923, the K28 class represented the first modern narrow-gauge locomotives on the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. These 10 engines featured 18 by 22-inch cylinders, 44-inch drivers, and generated 27,500 pounds of tractive effort at 200 pounds per square inch boiler pressure. The 28 designation indicates their pulling power in thousands of pounds. Alco's engineers incorporated modern features like Volschert valve gear and superheating, making these locomotives significantly more efficient than earlier designs. What makes them particularly interesting for mountain operations is their superior balance. Engine crews actually prefer the K28s, despite their lower power, because Alco's design runs smoother, making it less fatiguing during long days wrestling trains through mountain terrain. But that smoothness comes at a price. The firebox design can be tricky when the engine's working hard. The clamshell-style fire doors tend to pull into the backhead due to draft, and any leaking flues mean lost draft on the fire, making it harder to maintain steam pressure exactly when you need it most. 3 K28s remain operational on the Durango, and Silverton numbers 4, 73, 476, and 478 number 473 has been converted to oil burning and is fully operational. Number 476 also burns oil and runs regularly. These locomotives weigh 254,500 pounds loaded Alco-built locomotives for railroads worldwide, but the K28s represent their understanding of what narrow-gauge mountain railroading demanded. When you hear one climbing towards Silverton, you're hearing the sound of 1920s engineering that's still earning its keep a century later. That's impressive. It's also slightly terrifying when you remember it's running on track that's seen more than its share of accidents, fires, and floods. 4. Baldwin Locomotive Works, K37, Class 2-8-2, Mikado. Here's where things get weird. The K37 class started life as standard gauge Denver and Rio Grande Class 190 consolidation-type locomotives built by Baldwin in 1902. Between 1928 and 1930, the D and RGW's Burnham shops in Denver rebuilt 10 of these engines into narrow-gauge K37s, essentially creating new locomotives using only the original boilers. Everything else was built new. The K37s generate approximately 37,700 pounds of tractive effort, more than the K36s, making them the most powerful 2-8-2 Mikados on narrow gauge track. The outside frame design places driving wheels between two chassis frames with cylinders, rods, counterweights, and valve gear on the outside where you can see everything working. When a K37 is running hard, the motion of all that machinery is mesmerizing and slightly unnerving. What makes them scary is a reputation they didn't entirely deserve. When the Durango and Silverton originally acquired 4 K37s, they found that number 497 was hard on the track and struggled with the Animas Canyon section. This created the perception that all K37s were track killers. The truth was more mundane. The number 497 had suffered trailing truck damage in a 1960 wreck, causing mechanical issues specific to that locomotive. The Durango and Silverton now operates the number 493, which underwent extensive restoration, including conversion to oil burning. It runs alongside the K36s and K28s, handling the same demanding service. The K37s represent Depression-era resourcefulness, when the D and RGW couldn't afford new locomotives but needed more power. They took what they had and built something better. When a K37 rumbles through the Animas Canyon, you're watching the result of that engineering desperation, still earning its keep in the 21st century. 3. Pennsylvania Railroad S1 Class 6-4-4-6 duplex number 6100. In 1939, the Pennsylvania Railroad's Altoona Works completed the most ambitious passenger locomotive ever built and possibly the most dangerous. The S1 number 6100 was a 6-4-4-6 duplex drive locomotive stretching 140 feet, 2.5 inches, making it the longest rigid frame reciprocating steam locomotive ever constructed. Designed by Baldwin's Ralph Johnson with streamlining by Raymond Loewy, this million-pound monster was built to haul 1,200-ton trains at 100 miles per hour. The General Steel castings frame alone weighed 97,620 pounds, the largest single-piece locomotive casting ever made. With 84-inch drivers and 76,403 pounds of tractive effort, the S1 could theoretically hit speeds that terrified even experienced crews. Unconfirmed reports claim it exceeded 150 miles per hour, which would have been a world steam speed record. But here's what made it truly scary. The S1 was prone to violent, unpredictable wheel slip at any speed. The duplex design meant 2 sets of cylinders driving separate wheel sets on a rigid frame. When one set slipped, it could overspin catastrophically before the engineer even noticed, potentially tearing the drive mechanism apart. The locomotive was too long for most PRR curves and turntables, limiting it to the Chicago Crestline route. Engineers reported that at high speed, wheel slip could happen without warning, causing the drivers to spin freely while the massive locomotive surged and bucked like a mechanical bronco. The rigid wheelbase meant it couldn't negotiate standard railroad infrastructure. After barely 7 years of troubled service, PRR scrapped number 6100 in 1946. It proved that sometimes bigger isn't better. It's just more ways to fail spectacularly at 100 miles per hour. 2. Southern Pacific AC 12 Class 4-8-8-2, cab forward, number 4294. Baldwin Locomotive Works delivered the last of Southern Pacific's 256 cab-forward locomotives in March 1944. The AC-12 number 4294 was a 4-8-8-2 articulated giant weighing over 1 million pounds with tender designed backwards, or rather, forwards to solve a deadly problem. The 39 tunnels and 40 miles of snow sheds between Roseville and Sparks could asphyxiate crews in conventional locomotives. SP's solution was radical flip the entire locomotive around. The cab and firebox sat at the front, with the boiler pointing backward toward the tender. This meant crews breathed clean air while the exhaust and heat stayed behind them. The AC-12 generated 124,300 pounds of tractive effort with a boiler operating at 250 pounds per square inch. The massive 63.5-inch drivers could handle both mountain grades and desert straightaways. What made these locomotives scary was their fatal flaw. Oil lines ran beneath the cab to feed the firebox. A leak could spray oil on the rails ahead of the driving wheels. In 1941, a cab forward with leaking steam entered the tunnel at Santa Susana Pass. Water on the rails caused wheel slip, the train slipped backward, a coupler broke, and the crew was trapped in a tunnel filling with exhaust while oil ignited beneath the cab. Killing everyone aboard the cab, forward design saved countless lives in the Sierra Nevada, but it created new ways to die. When you're riding in the cab of a locomotive with 600-degree oil lines running beneath your feet and 1 million pounds of articulated machinery behind you, climbing grades where one oil leak means burning alive or slipping backward into oblivion, you understand why crews called them backups. Number 4, 1,294, survives at the California State Railroad Museum, the only cab forward preserved from SP's fleet. 1. Lima Locomotive Works 2-6-6-6, Allegheny H-8, number 1601. Lima Locomotive Works built the Chesapeake and Ohio H-8 Allegheny in 1941, and it remains one of the most powerful steam locomotives ever constructed. At 778,000 pounds for the engine alone and generating 110,200 pounds of tractive effort, the 2-6-6-6 configuration meant 6 coupled driving axles providing unprecedented adhesion. The Allegheny wasn't designed for passenger service or light freight. It was built to haul massive amounts of coal over the Allegheny Mountains on grades that would stall other locomotives. The firebox measured 135 square feet, the largest ever applied to a locomotive. Boiler pressure hit 260 pounds per square inch, feeding 4 cylinders that could generate 7,498 indicated horsepower. These machines regularly hauled 5,000-ton coal trains over 2.0% grades unassisted. What made them terrifying was their assignment to Russell, Kentucky, where they tackled the new river grade 80 miles of curves, grades, and tunnels through terrain that had defeated lesser railroads. The locomotives operated at the absolute limit of what steel could withstand. Crews reported that at full throttle, the entire 100-ton machine would physically lift and slam with each piston stroke, track ballast flying like shrapnel. The H-8s earned a reputation for being track destroyers. Their massive weight and power literally hammered the rails into submission. Track maintenance crews followed these locomotives like battlefield medics, replacing bent rails and crushed ballast. Between 1941 and 1948, Lima built 60 Alleghenies. Most were scrapped by 1956, victims of dieselization. Only 2 survive in museums. They represent the absolute pinnacle of steam power applied to the worst geography American railroading could offer. When C&O needed to move Appalachian coal to market, they didn't go around the mountains. They built locomotives that could punch straight through them. These American-made locomotives didn't become legends because they were comfortable or safe. They earned their reputation by going where nothing should go and doing what physics said was impossible. From Georgetown Loop's Devil's Gate to Cajun Pass's killer grades, from Mount Washington's Arctic summit to White Pass's avalanche zones, these machines operated in conditions that would terrify modern crews. They represent an era when no wasn't an answer, when engineers solved problems by building bigger locomotives and sending braver crews, and when the measure of a railroad was what it could conquer, not what it could avoid. Baldwin, ALCO, Manchester, and EMD built machines that changed America one terrifying grade at a time. If you enjoyed this deep dive into America's most fearsome locomotives, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We've got more railroad history, more engineering marvels, and more stories about the machines that built this country. Drop a comment telling us which locomotive scared you most, and check out our other videos exploring the trains that made America possible. Until next time, keep those wheels turning and that steam pressure up. We'll see you down the line.